listening to part 5 of our 20-part series, Marvelous Mints, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Thank you so much, Gemini. Let's see. When we left off, we were talking about rosemary and sage. Did you have occasion to use either of those herbs in the past couple of weeks?
I did. I did try some sage tea, and it was quite delightful.
Isn't it, though?
It is.
Put a good dollop of honey in with it.
No, actually I didn't. I used a little bit of stevia because I grow that, and it's growing abundantly right now.
It is. It's a very abundant plant. I saw one in someone's garden just the other day. I really like the honey in with the sage because the honey is so demulcent and so helpful for the throat and keeping the throat healthy during the wintertime.
Oh, well, that's true.
Right.
I should do that next time, yes.
It's not just a sweetener. It's actually demulcent.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I'll try that next.
Yeah. So I'm so glad that you did have an opportunity to try the sage tea, and I hope the listeners have as well. And, of course, if they didn't hear the first 4 parts of the series, those are archived, yes, and they can go back and hear them?
Absolutely, yes. They'll be up at the Time Monk Radio website and on our YouTube channel.
At Time Monk Radio website and at your YouTube channel. Perfect.
Correct.
So just to jump in then with our first herb of this month, which is ground ivy. Now, I always have to start talking about ground ivy by talking about what a fool I was, or almost was. It wasn't quite, but could have been. I was a very novice herbalist and a pretty novice animal keeper as well. And one of the authors that I felt reached out to me and was really there for me and really helpful for me was Juliette de Berkeley-Levy. Later on, I was privileged to meet her, and actually not too much later after that, I was privileged to become publisher of her books. But back in the days that we're talking about, I certainly didn't know her or would have imagined that I would have the opportunity to meet her and to share time and space with her. And something had happened with one of the goats, and she suggested in one of her books, probably The Herbal for Farm and Stable, that ground ivy be used. And I, not knowing better, thought she meant ivy that had been ground up. In the same way we would say ground meat.
Okay.
So fortunately, I didn't have access to ivy, which is a poisonous plant. I probably wouldn't have killed the goat because goats' digestive systems, fortunately, are quite different than human digestive systems. But I sure got it wrong. And it was that experience and many other experiences that really encouraged me to learn the botanical names of plants and to train myself to recognize the plants by their botanical names. And in a way that's very true of ground ivy. And ground ivy taught me something else about the botanical names of plants. And that is that I first heard of it by a whole host of common names. And I'll tell you a bunch of those common names because they're kind of fun. But it was years and years before I ever heard anyone refer to it as glaucoma hederaceae. And I found that it took me a very long and arduous time to get that rather strange and awkward name into my head, glaucoma hederaceae. Partly because I was so used to thinking of it by the common name. And so it really encouraged me as a teacher to move my students to learn the plants by their botanical names. To learn them first by their botanical names, because that's the way it's really going to stick with you. And to learn them by the botanical names so you don't wind up grinding up ivy and giving it to your goats. When what's really meant is glaucoma hederaceae, also known as Lizzie, run up the hedge. Lizzie, go to by the hedge. Lizzie, go to the hedge. Gill, creep by the ground. Gill, over the hill. Alehoof, cut's foot. Robin, run in the hedge. Cat's foot, cat's paw. Creeping Charlie, turn hoof, hay maid, hedge maid, and my favorite, creeping Jenny. And in fact, I have not exhausted the names of this plant because this plant is so common in so many gardens that it has a whole host of other unrepeatable on the radio names that gardeners give to it. Now, why would it have all these terrible, unrepeatable names? Well, let me describe Glaucoma hederaceae, ground ivy, creeping Jenny, to you. And if it grows in your garden, you'll know what kind of names you call it. In the General History of Plants by Gerard says, ground ivy is a low or base herb. It creepeth and spreadeth upon the ground, hither and thither all about, with many stalks of uncertain length, slender like those of the vine, and thereupon grow leaves something broad and round, amongst which come forth the flowers gaping like little hoods, not unlike those of germander of a purplish blue color. The whole plant is of a strong smell and bitter in taste. It find it in tilled and untilled places, upon banks, under hedges, and by the sides of houses. And here we have Felter and Lloyd from about 1899 saying, the plant Glaucoma hederaceae is a perennial, gray, hairy herb with a prostate creeping stem radiating at the base, square, and from a few inches to 1 to 2 feet long. The leaves are petiolate, opposite roundish, cordate reniform, crenate, hairy, and glaucous on both sides, though often purplish beneath. The flowers of a bluish purple, about 3 together, in axillary whorls. And if you haven't recognized it yet, I think Maud Greaves gives the very best description of it. The root is perennial, and it throws out long, trailing, unbranched, square stems, which root everywhere and bear numerous kidney-shaped leaves of a dark green tint, somewhat downy and having regular, rounded indentations on the margins. The leaves are well stalked, and opposite to one another, the undersides paler or purplish, and dotted with glands. The flowers place 3 or 4 together in the axils of the upper leaves. Yes, indeed. If you live or garden in the temperate regions of the world, creeping Jenny is in your garden or in your yard or in the planting boxes or under the hedges where you live. Besides calling it bad names because it roots everywhere in the garden, what else could we say about this? Well, Adele Dawson tells us that this little herb belongs to Venus, who rules ease, comfort, and love, and is never far from human habitation to find Glaucoma hederaceae waiting, inconspicuous, until it is needed. A woman called me up one day, and she asked me if I could come to her house and show her Gunderaba. And I said I wasn't sure, that I would call her back very shortly. And after I said goodbye, I called a German friend, and I asked her, was ist Gunderaba? She says, oh, Gunderaba. Oh, so Gundermann. And Gundermann is Glaucoma hederaceae. You see, no matter what name anyone calls it in any language, the botanical name remains the same. And so when we know those, we have that special, secret way of knowing about the plants. And so I was able to call the woman back and say, "Hello, I will come to your house, and I will find Gundaraba for you," expecting that I would be able to find some growing in her garden or under the hedge. Well, when I got to her house, this plant, which I have read 3 descriptions of, and you see that it's generally a prostate small plant hugging the ground. This plant was growing knee-high in her yard, and it was just about the only thing in her yard. I have never before or since seen such a profusion of Glaucoma hederaceae creeping Jenny, which certainly was not creeping where she lived, just waving in the breeze to her. I got out of my car and almost had to sit down again laughing. I had never imagined that it would be so easy to show this plant to her. And I asked her then, of course, why on earth she wanted me to come out and to show her ground ivy, creeping Jenny, Gundaraba, Gundarman, all those wonderful names we have for this beautiful little plant. And she related this story to me. She told me that her lungs were very weak because of some childhood traumas that she had gone through, and that her doctor, the doctor who took care of her in Switzerland, always prescribed Gundaraba for her, which is why, of course, it has a slightly different name in German. And that she was actually allergic to antibiotics, but she had frequent bronchitis and lung infections, and that this little plant was the only thing that seemed to cure those lung infections for her. And when she moved to the United States, she realized that she didn't know what it looked like because she had always gotten it in prepared form from the doctor, and that no one in the United States knew what it was. So I was very, very happy to be able to reunite her with this plant that had been so useful for her, and to help her figure out ways to use it. Now, of course, one of my favorite ways of using this plant is to simply throw it into salads. And I use the leaves year-round in salads. They are a little tough, but that little tough means that they're pretty frost-hardy. And so they're a wonderful green early on in the spring and late in the fall, when one would think there's not much out to put in the salads. Then ground ivy, what did Adele Dawson say? Waiting, inconspicuous, to be of use. Then ground ivy really, really shines. So many people have written so much about this plant that I hardly know where to start in telling you about its considerable uses. So let's just jump in and we'll kind of put it together as we go. Herbalists say that ground ivy is a tonic, astringent, pectoral, anti-inflammatory, diuretic, anti-scorbutic, mild stimulant. So we can remember from when we were together before, and we were talking about the mints in general, that the mints in general do tend to be anti-inflammatory. We also probably remember, well, aren't the mints often somewhat anti-infective? They can be, especially rosemary and sage, which we talked about just before. But although some people describe glaucoma as having a very strong scent, I don't find it to be particularly strongly scented. And I think that for me, explains partly why it's not known as being an anti-infective. That doesn't mean it hasn't been used in that way. Culpeper called ground ivy a singular herb for all inward wounds. And he says the juice dropped into the ear doth wonderfully help the noise and singing in them, and helpeth the hearing, which is the decayed. Isn't that a wonderful use for this little plant that can be so difficult in the garden to somehow macerate it into a juice or make a very strong tea of it and then drop it or pour it into the ears to help to increase the ability to hear and to help get rid of tinnitus, the sounds in ears, which afflicts actually millions of Americans. Gerard recommended a combination of ground ivy, celandine, and English daisy in equal parts, bruised and strained, and put into rose water with a little sugar, and then dropped with a feather into the eyes to taketh away all manner of inflammation, spots, webs, itch, smarting, or any grief whatsoever in the eyes. Others have found that gill over the ground in celandine with a little honey offers immediate relief for any problem in the eyes. Now, I wonder a little bit at the inclusion of glaucoma heteroceae here, because I can tell you from personal experience that celandine eye wash, for me, healed a corneal scratch in under 2 hours. There is nothing so powerful as an eye wash for healing injuries to the eyes, in my estimation, than celandine. So adding the ground ivy to it, and to me, feels a little bit like gilding the lily. The honey, the sugar, that might be a good idea, because my experience with celandine as an eye wash was that it hurt so much when I did it that I was almost certain I had blinded myself. Of course, the end result was well worth having, but a little bit of honey might have really saved me some scare time in terms of that. So I find it interesting that both modern and older herbalists combine the gill over the ground along with the celandine, both of which are semi-evergreen plants. The celandine is certainly quite evergreen plants. I've literally dug it up out from under the snow and found beautiful, beautiful green leaves. And the ground ivy, which is so low-growing, I have not had an opportunity to dig up during the winter, but maybe I'll try it this winter and see if it is truly evergreen and green there underneath all of the snow. Salter and Lloyd, again from 1899, say ground ivy is a pectoral that is recommended for all diseases of the lungs as well as for diseases of the kidneys. Asthma, jaundice, hypochondria, and monomania are usefully treated by this herb. So isn't that an interesting thing to say? That first we have this, the diseases of the lungs and kidneys, and we get this sense of this really medicinal plant, asthma and jaundice, and then we have these two things that today we would kind of make fun of or snicker at. We would say, oh, hypochondria, truly, come on, now that's not in a medical book, is it? Well, yeah. It was actually considered to be a disease a little different than what we think of it today. But again, what a great idea. You have a friend who always seems to have something wrong with them. You tell them that this wonderful plant that grows everywhere can be of great benefit to them, and all they have to do is drink it as a tea. I wonder what would happen. And monomania would be what I think the French call a dysphasie, and someone gets absolutely fixated on something and one can't seem to open up their mind to anything else at all. And little ground ivy, with its ability to root everywhere and to have nodes and spring out little roots, seems nonetheless to help those who are in the clutch of being too focused, to spread out, and to relax. The infusion of the leaves of Glaucoma hederaceae is highly recommended in lead colic, and it is stated that painters who make use of it often are never troubled with that affliction. Now, of course, painters nowadays do not paint with lead paints, and yet lead paints were used. And there are many people living in houses that were painted with lead paint. And so what a wonder to have a little remedy that grows right outside our doors, an infusion of the leaves of creeping jenny, ground ivy, gill over the ground is used and highly recommended both to prevent and to deal with an excess of lead in the body. It would be amazing and interesting if someone finds that their water or their blood or their body has cypher lead to give this a try and see what happens and get back to me and let me know, because if it's really helpful, don't we want everyone to know? Maud Greaves quotes from Green in the Universal Herbal of 1832 and says that ground ivy expels the plants which grow near it. That might be one of the reasons that gardeners have such bad names for this plant. And then Maud Greaves goes into a story that I have heard in a great many places. It was one of the principal plants used by the early Saxons to clarify their beers before hops had been introduced, hence the names Tannhoof and Alehoof. It not only improved the flavor and keeping qualities of the beer, but rendered it clearer. And this little plant was used for that purpose until the reign of Henry VIII. Gill is from the French gillier, which means to ferment beer. But gill also means a girl, and thus the plant has come to be associated with girls or maids. I gather creeping jenny, anytime it's there. To me, this is a plant that I pick when I need it, and I hardly ever think about preserving it. I might make a vinegar of it, but I do know midwives who make a tincture of it. And most of the time, when we're asking ourselves, when is the real height of this plant? When is it at its greatest energy? When is it singing its most beautiful song? And for most of us, that's when it's in full flower, generally in May. That may vary a little depending on your elevation or how far south you are, but there'll come a point when all of the creeping jenny in the yard suddenly bursts into flower if we're not mowing it down. And it's at that point that I go out and harvest it for making a vinegar, and that midwives go out to harvest it to make a tincture. They claim that the tincture of Glaucoma hederaceae draws down the placenta should the placenta be stuck. Generally, in a normal birth, the baby is expelled. There's a resting period, and then at the end of that resting period, the uterus starts contracting again. The uterus during that resting period has removed itself from the wall of the uterus. The placenta has freed itself from the uterus, and it is now ready to be expelled. But sometimes, especially if the woman is feeling uncomfortable or scared, she might be holding on, although she's given birth. After all, the baby's pretty big. It's hard to prevent that. She can hold on to that placenta. And the ground ivy, the midwives say, pulls it down and out of her. And they use it in dropperful doses, the tincture of the ground ivy, as frequently as every 5 minutes to help the woman open and loosen, and the placenta to let go. Ground ivy has been endowed with singular curative virtues and is one of the most popular remedies for cough and nervous headache, says Maud Greaves. It is an excellent cooling beverage and is often known as gill tea when it is sweetened with honey. She suggests 1 ounce of the fresh herb infused with a pint of boiling water, sweetened with honey, and drunk when cool 3 or 4 times a day. It is a favorite remedy for those who have coughs of long standing. It is much used by those who have consumption. Ground ivy was at one time one of the cries of London. Ground ivy, whoo, by my ground ivy, whoo, glaucoma, here, gill over the ground. And it was used then as a tea to purify the blood and keep away contagion. It is serviceable in all pectoral complaints, and especially in cases of weakness of the lungs and weakness of the digestive organs through its tonifying and stimulating ability. It has long been discarded from the official Materia Medica in favor of other plants that are more drug-like. But the sweet ground ivy has so many uses for home medicine. Remember, one of the descriptions of this plant was that the leaves were kidney-shaped. And when you look right down on the plant, you do indeed see them looking quite kidney-shaped. Now, you have to slice the kidneys in half to see this kidney shape, because the kidneys, when they're whole, kind of look like jelly beans. But when you cut them, you see where the renal blood vessel goes in, and then you see that kind of kidney bean shape that we see in the leaf of the glaucoma. And that's an easy way to remember that it helps anytime there's a problem with the kidneys, as well as remember from the description that the leaf was described as being hairy. And that's usually a mark that indicates an effectiveness within the lungs, an effectiveness within the chest. The fresh herb taken very, very hot and in a very strong tea can be diaphoretic and diuretic, and is curative of headache when all other remedies have failed. So I kind of envision the woman with the migraine, and she boils up some ground ivy and drinks it as hot as she can, and it loosens everything for her and makes her sweat and makes her pee, because it's loosening up everything and loosening up the hold that headache had. Gerard says that he quotes Dioscorides as saying that this is an excellent remedy against sciatica or ache in the huckle bone. The women of our northern parts, says Maud Greaves, especially of Wales and Cheshire, do turn herb ale hoof into their ale, and they say it purges their head from rheumatic humors and all pains that flow from the head. So what an interesting remedy there, that they put it into their beer. In a way, this is an older way of making a tincture of a plant, rather than actually taking the plant and tincturing it in vodka or Everclear. The plant was steeped into beer or wine that was consumed usually very quickly. So it wasn't left to steep for a very long time, but the fresh herb was put into it. So many ways and so many uses to use glaucoma hederaceae. I like this. The ancient herbalist said it will cure insanity and melancholia by opening the stopping of the spleen. It regulates the heartbeat by making the blood more fluid, and it aids the glandular tissues to produce more hormones and to prevent aging. Well, what can we say? Gill of the ground, ground ivy, creeping jenny, and glaucoma hederaceae. We're so glad that you are right outside our door, because green blessings are everywhere, and herbal medicine is people's medicine. So you know what your assignment is for this week, Gemini?
I do, I think.
You've got to find some glaucoma hederaceae.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any growing in my yard. I'm gonna have to look.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
not, I'll check the neighbor's yard.
Check the neighbor's yard. Gardens. It likes gardens. It likes walkways. It likes, as its name implies, under hedges.
Yeah, I'll have to look for that.
It's a little harder to find right now because it's not flowering. It's easiest to find when it's flowering. But it's also, if you live in a place where there's frost, it's a little easier to find now because there are not so many other green things out.
Oh, okay. We haven't had our first frost yet, so.
Right, we haven't had our frost yet, but things are already dying back.
Sure.
Right?
Yes.
You know, many of the trees, like already a couple of weeks ago, went, oh, yeah, bye.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Here, have a few leaves.
Yes. But I'll definitely get out and look at it and see if I can find any before we speak again.
Okay, good.
This concludes part 5 of our 20-part series, Marvelous Mints, The Wise Woman Way with Susan Wade at Time Monk Radio.